Ooh, ooh. I am the ghost of testing past. Let me test addition. 2 plus 2. It works. Ooh. Ooh. I am the ghost of testing present. Not for me the manual labor of running tests one by one. No, no. I automate my tests. 2 plus 2 should be 4. 2 plus 3 should be 6. And I can run them whenever I like, as often as I like. Let me compile my test suite. Ta-da! And should a test fail, I get precise information about the problem. Ooh. Ooh. I am the ghost of testing future. Not for me the manual labor of automating tests one by one. No, no. I state general properties of my code. Plus is commutative. Plus is associative. For all x and y, x plus y equals y plus x. And when I've stated my properties, I simply give them to quick check. And quick check generates as many tests as I want for me, quickly giving me confidence that my property really holds. Should a property not hold, then I get a counterexample in simplified form. For example, if I add 1/5, 1.0, and minus 1.0, addition, floating point addition is not associative. Ooh. Okay. You'd be forgiven for wondering, what on earth was that? That was the first few minutes of a talk that I gave a few years ago at an event called The Future of Programming. And my talk was called The Future of Testing. It was about Quick Check, my random testing tool. And the event was early in January. So I gambled that many people would have seen a film version, perhaps, of Charles Dickens' famous novel, A Christmas Carol, over Christmas, in which the ghosts of Christmas past, Christmas present, and Christmas future appear to torment Ebenezer Scrooge. So I thought it might be topical from that point of view. But why else? Why start the talk that way? Well, one reason is that I got to start the talk with examples. So very quickly, even if you had never heard of Quick Check before, you would have some idea of what it does and what the rest of my talk is going to be about. It's quite tempting when you're an inexperienced speaker to start off with generalities and talking about things in the abstract. And really, people don't take that in. It's much, much better to start off with concrete examples, as I did. What else? I got to show a demo. There's no clearer way to show people what it is you're working with than by demoing a tool or software, if that's possible. But finally, I surprised my audience. I can guarantee you nobody was reading their email while I was acting out those ghosts. Sit at the back of the conference room in one of the meetings this week and look at what's on people's screens. You'll see a lot of email, social media, maybe the newspaper. So there's a lot to compete for people's attention nowadays. And unless you have to grab the audience's attention. If you don't do that in the first 5 minutes, you've lost them. They're not going to listen to the rest of the talk. So giving a talk, it's a performance. You're putting on a show, and you have to look at it that way. And that's really just as well, because maybe you're a shy, retiring person. That doesn't matter. That's not the persona that you project when you're doing a show. You have to act out an exciting presenter while you're giving that presentation. It's very different giving a talk at a conference from just explaining an idea to a few friends around a whiteboard. That's not a show situation, not a performance, but a conference talk really is. And you shouldn't be afraid of going over the top when you do this. Let me give you an example. Phil Wadler is an excellent speaker. And what he likes to do is to take his most important slide, it might be a categorical diagram or some typing rules or whatever, and he draws it on a t-shirt. And then he wears that t-shirt and he wears another shirt over it. And when he gets to that slide in the talk, he just takes off the shirt, and there is the diagram on his chest. It's fantastic. Does he do that because you can see the diagram better on his chest than on the screen? Of course not. He does it to surprise you, to shock you, because you can't really believe that a distinguished professor is stripping off in front of you. And that's a way of keeping the attention of the audience, which Phil is a master at. You should also, of course, you should talk to your audience. Don't talk at them. You can look the audience in the eye. That's helpful. Quite a helpful thing to do as well sometimes is to ask the audience a question. That's a good people to get people engaged. And I've given a lot of talks about Quick Check to software developers. I like to start those talks with a question. So let me try it out on you. Okay, you ready? Who really, really loves testing? Okay, 3 out of 50 people. Actually, even with software developers, that's the kind of response that I get. And it's great because it lets me say, I didn't used to enjoy testing either before we created Quick Check. So that's great. It's always best when you ask the audience a question to ask one to which you know the answer, so you know how to respond to it. Like that one. The answer is always the same. Okay, well, that's enough fun. Let's get serious. Here's the outline of my talk. First of all, I'm going to do an introduction. Well, I've done that, of course. Then I'm going to talk about the problem. After that, I'm going to show you my solution. And I have some results, which I will discuss. I'll talk about related work, and then I shall conclude. Did you learn anything from that? Of course not. But very often, one learns nothing from an outline slide. So during this week, I'm sure you'll see a lot of outline slides. After every one, I want you to ask yourselves, what did I learn from that? And if the answer is nothing, you know it shouldn't have been there. So why are outline slides so useless? Well, because you have to present them quickly, and at this point, you can't really give enough detail that people will really know what you're talking about. So it's just abstract generalities. Now, I wasted 1 minute on this slide. 1 minute out of a 20-minute slot is precious. You can't afford to give that up. But I have seen people try and solve this problem by going into more detail as they present the outline slide. I've seen people waste 5 minutes out of 20 on an outline slide. And when this happens, I'm just sitting there thinking, why don't you get on with the talk? So conference talks are so short that you don't need this kind of scaffolding. Just go straight to the point. So knowing that a talk is short is a very important insight. The first time you give a conference talk, maybe it's 30 minutes long even, you may feel you have an ocean of time ahead of you. But you don't. Time is always very, very short. And you have to prioritize very hard to choose what you're going to put in the talk. The outline slide, not worth it. Something else that you can consider omitting, although not everybody agrees with this, is the related work slide. I've seen people present a slide with 4 or 5 papers on at the beginning of a talk, and they tell me, in 1 or 2 sentences how each one differs from the idea they haven't told me about yet. And I just get nothing from that. So think about related work. It's essential, of course, in the paper. It would be unscientific not to include it. And the referees would throw your work out. But in a talk, it doesn't necessarily justify the time spent on it. So, as I say, you have to be very focused when you give a talk. And you have to know what you're trying to achieve. So what is that? Well, it's not explaining your paper in depth. That just is not possible in the time that you have available. So what is it? What are you trying to do? You're trying to sell your paper to the audience. If people go away from your talk thinking, that was interesting, I must read that paper, then you've achieved what you set out to achieve. That's the purpose of your talk, really. It's also important to think about who is your audience. Now, if you're an inexperienced speaker, it's very easy to feel that everybody in the audience knows more about this topic than you do. But of course, that's completely untrue. You know more about your own work than anybody else. Maybe there are 2 or 3 experts in the room who know more about the area than you do. But the majority of people there will not. So if you spend your talk trying to show those 2 or 3 experts how clever you are, you're wasting the time of the other 100 people in the room. Aim your talk at the least well-informed people in the audience. Explain too much rather than too little. And you know what the experts will be thinking if you do that? They're not going to be thinking, he's talking about stupid, boring stuff. They're going to be admiring your pedagogy. And maybe next time they'll steal some of your pedagogical ideas for their own talks. Everybody enjoys a good explanation. It's useful also to think about what, if there's one thing you want people to remember from your talk, what should it be? So there's always a lot of things you could explain in a paper, and it's tempting to try and say something about each of them. But if you do that, you'll end up talking about a lot of ideas superficially, without giving your audience a really good understanding of any one of them. So it's much better to pick on one interesting idea and explain it well, and then at the end of the talk to say, there's more where that came from, than to try and superficially cover everything in your paper. Okay. So, your problem. How are you going to explain what your problem is? Absolutely the best way, I would say, is to show an example, as I did at the beginning of this talk. But that isn't really enough. You also have to persuade people that this problem is one they should care about solving. Otherwise, they may see, well, you know, you ask your research question, I suppose you could ask that, but why should I care about the result? And indeed, we can learn something. Remember I said that your talk is trying to sell your paper. We can learn something from sales techniques. This is the Bible of complex sales, selling complex technology. Spin selling, a very, very influential sales technique. SPIN is an acronym. It stands for situation. First, you must establish the customer situation. Do that fairly quickly. Then problem, you have to identify the customer's problem. Then you might think, now you should offer a solution. Solution, it's actually this part, need payoff. Why did they call it need payoff and not solution? Well, I think that's obvious. What kind of acronym would SPIS be? But there's something in between. Implication. And what is that? That's where your customer may have recognized that, yes, I have this problem, but it's actually not keeping me up at night. I've got far more important things to worry about. So implication consists of persuading the customer, or in this case your audience, that this problem really matters, that it's really worth doing something about. Let me show you an example. This is a slide from another talk about Quick Check. And in this case, I was showing a bug that we found in a CAN bus protocol stack. So what is a CAN bus? It's actually the most commonly used network in vehicles. So most processors in a car or a truck will talk to each other over the CAN bus. And of course, the processors have to have a software protocol stack to use the bus. So this is a test case for such a stack that QuickCheck found. To understand it, you need to know that every message on the CAN bus has a priority. The smaller the priority number, the higher the priority for the bus. So what does the test case do? It sends a message with priority 1, or we can see it being sent. That's good. And then the test case calls the protocol stack to send 2 more messages with priorities 2 and 3. But the bus is busy. So those messages cannot be sent yet. Instead, the stack must queue them up. And the final step of the test case is a confirmation call. So this part of the API is usually used by lower-level software, the hardware bus driver. And it calls it to say, I'm confirming that I've finished sending message number 1. Now, the stack can choose another message to send. Which one should it send? The one with priority 2. Which one did it send, in this case? The one with priority 3. That's the bug. So we were very happy that we found this with QuickCheck, but you know, what's a little priority inversion between friends? Maybe it doesn't matter. So at this point in the talk, I say, these priorities are there for a reason. Almost everything in the car talks over the CAN bus. The stereo, the brakes. Here's a tip. Don't adjust the volume during emergency braking. You see what I did there? I turned priority inversion, perhaps a small bug, into a question of life or death. So you want to do this kind of thing. You need to persuade people that your problem is important. Let's talk about slides. How many of you have seen a slide like this? Yeah. How many of you have seen slides like this? This is actually part of an early plan for this talk, so I might have inflicted this slide on you. What about this? Yes, you see a lot of these at Popple and ICFP. Perhaps we'll see some at Uppsala as well. What's astonishing is how often, after somebody has put a slide like this up, they say, most of these rules are standard. This is the one I want you to look at. If this is the only rule I'm supposed to read, this is the only rule that should be on the slide. So this is a very common mistake, that people put far too much information on the slides. And the other information serves only to distract the audience from what you're saying. So don't put it there. Minimize what goes on the slides. By the way, I wonder if this will work. You in the back, who can read that speech bubble easily? Okay, maybe half. Yeah, that is the default size of font that PowerPoint uses. So why is that? Because PowerPoint is really designed for giving talks to a small group of people in a small room. And in that case, everybody can read this size font. When you use it at a conference, you may be in a much larger room than this, people at the back have no chance of reading text in that size. So I usually double the size of the font. And if you don't think of doing that, the back half of the room will not be able to read your slides. And people who can't read your slides will not listen to what you have to say. So I think this is perhaps the most common serious mistake that you see in talks at big conferences. Too many speakers have slides that you just cannot read except in the front part of the room. I've got a picture here of a meeting room in which a friend of mine was unfortunate enough to be giving a talk. This is the kind of thing you see far too often. So she was very creative, and she got people to get up from their desks and stand by the projector so that they could actually see what the slide said. But you can't do that at a big conference like Uppsala. So conferences are very often given in hotel ballrooms with a low ceiling, which means the screen can't be very large and it can't be very high up. That's why you have to use such large fonts. Also, quite often, the bottom quarter of the slide, or the bottom third even, may be invisible to people sitting at the back because of other people's heads. So here's a tip. If you know many people won't be able to read the bottom third of your slide, don't put anything important there. I have on occasion, when I've seen the room I'm speaking in, gone through my slides and just moved everything up a bit. And that can be well worth doing. Okay, so large fonts on slides. Let me show you a few slides from a keynote I gave a dozen years ago at ICFP. Again, I was talking about testing. This is the estimated cost to the US economy of bugs in software in 2002. $60 billion. It's a huge amount of money. It's $200 for every man, woman, and child in the USA. So we have a strong motivation to try and minimize bugs in our software. But let's put this number in perspective. This is the estimated turnover of the software industry in 2002, the US software industry. So this is even more money. Now, how much of that, I wonder, was spent on software development? Well, I can only guess. Some of it will have gone on marketing, some of it will have gone to Bill Gates, but let's guess that maybe half of it was spent on development, 120 billion. How much of that was spent on testing? If you ask people what proportion of the cost of a software project is made up of testing, you get differing answers, but kind of ballpark, 50%. Okay, 50% of 120 billion, that's also 60 billion. So the money spent on testing seems to be roughly the same as the cost to society of the remaining errors. And there's a lesson here for us researchers. If we come up with a brilliant technique that can entirely eliminate errors from software, it would still be a mistake to apply it to all software development if it costs more than twice as much as testing. Because there's only this much that one can gain by eliminating errors. So that is a strong motivation for me, not just to be interested in things like proving software correct, which is very effective but quite expensive, but also to do research on making testing more effective and perhaps even cheaper. So those slides were conveying that message. Of course, I could have presented the information differently, like this, for example, but it would have had much less effect. So it's important to remember that your slides are not your teleprompter. Right? What you want to do is to talk about what's on your slides. If you find yourself reading out what's on the slides, that's often a sign that you've written things that you should not have done. Writing too much will just, once again, distract the audience from what it is that you're saying. By the way, there's something even worse I could have done. You want to see it? No, you're going to. Software errors cost the US economy $60 billion a year. The turnover of the industry is around $240 billion. Testing makes up 50% of the cost of a typical software project. Are you annoyed yet? It's infuriating, isn't it? So don't do that. That really makes it emphasizes the medium over the message. Just don't do it. I'm not saying don't use animations at all. Here's a slide of mine that does. I use animations quite a lot. But use them, for example, to emphasize a diff between two slides, or to direct attention to what you're talking about. This is a slide about a bug we found in a 3G radio base station, so you can tell how long ago this was. Base stations communicate with handsets. Nowadays they're called user equipment in the cell. And while a handset is communicating with a base station, then it has a dedicated radio channel. It did in 3G anyway. But there aren't as many radio channels available as there are handsets in a cell. So when a handset is idle, then it doesn't have one of these things. But the base station still needs to be able to communicate, or send messages at least, to all the handsets in its cell. So to do that, as well as these dedicated radio channels, there's what's called a signaling channel, which goes from the base station to all of the handsets. Now, by definition, there's only one of these, but you still have to set it up, because you have to specify parameters: power, frequency, maybe even which antenna to use. So when the controller of the base station can send a message saying, set up your signaling channel like this, and the base station then does so, and it says, yeah, that's okay. Okay, so this is part of the protocol for controlling a base station. So now here's a question. What happens if we send another setup message? Well, we shouldn't do that, right? Because there is already a signaling channel. But you can imagine it happening if the controller, for example, reboots at some point. It might send a repeated message. No problem, the base station says, no, I've already got one of these. I'm not going to set up another. We tested this particular base station, and we discovered that this is what it did. Almost always. But QuickCheck found a combination of parameters that would make the base station say yes to the second one. And it would set up 2 signaling channels. And once you've done that, you've violated a very fundamental invariant of the base station software. And sure enough, within a second, it would crash. You could do nothing more with that base station until you rebooted it, which took at least 2 minutes. So it was a good bug to find. Okay, so you can see I had a lot of animations here, but I was just using them to emphasize the part of the slide that I was talking about. I think that's a good use of animation. Okay, we are a little short on time, and it's a good idea when you're planning a talk to bear in mind that it may take a slightly different time from what you intended, especially if you have a demo. They take a rather unpredictable amount of time, but you still want to finish at the right time. Talking while people want coffee is just not a good idea. So what you can do is you can plan some places in your talk where you can skip material. And I would always do that. I've just done so now.
I think we can go a few minutes over because we started later.
You say that.
Yeah.
Everybody else wants their coffee. Yes. So you might notice that I was shuffling some papers here. One of the things I was thinking about talking about is nerves. I can't honestly claim to be nervous before a talk nowadays. I've just done it so many times. But when you're less experienced, it's very common. One of the ways that you can help address nerves is by writing a script. And that just can give you confidence that you're not going to suddenly panic and forget what you intended to say next. What is a script? A script is not a document on which you write down everything you're going to say. If so, you'd be reading it like this. That would be awful. But what is handy is to have just some bullet points in a large font so that you can just glance down if you want to remind yourself what you plan to say next. It has to be something that you can absorb at a glance. That's not to say, so I'm saying that you should have bullet points in your script. Of course, sometimes you might want to plan exactly what you're going to say. For most of the talk, I would not do so. I think it's better to rely on speaking freely. But maybe the first few sentences when you begin your talk, you might want to plan in detail. Maybe the sentence you're going to say at the end of the talk, you might want to think carefully about that. And perhaps a few key phrases in between you might also want to plan. I've got one of those. I have another example for you about this slide. This was a slide that I didn't prepare myself, actually. 2 colleagues of mine had a paper at ICFP a few years ago on parallel parsing. Very nice work. But when the time came, things had come up, and neither of them was able to go to the conference. So they asked me, would I give the talk? So they gave me the slides. All I had to do was present them. And they were lovely slides. It was a nice talk, I think. But towards the end, This slide was introducing what was actually the hardest part of the problem. So the idea here is to do parsing in parallel. It turns out the most difficult thing to parse, believe it or not, is a sequence of things. Why? How can that be hard? Well, if you think of the parse tree that you would naturally build for a sequence, it'll be a linear list. That is an awful data structure for parallelism. You can't traverse it in parallel, and it's awkward to build it in parallel. So you don't want to use that shape of syntax tree. What you want to do instead is, once you've recognized a whole bunch of y's, the input here is along the diagonal, and the syntax tree we're building grows this way. Of course, you shouldn't build a linear list, should you? You should build a binary tree. So you recognize the individual y's, you pair adjacent ones up, you pair those nodes up, and bingo. We've built a balanced data structure that we can do in parallel. Everything's great. Except there's a problem. If you think about it, at this point, when you've recognized the y's, and now you need to start combining them, you need to combine the odd-numbered y's with the even-numbered ones. But how can you know which are the odd-numbered y's? How can you know which pairs of nodes you should combine? It's very hard. And in fact, this was the hardest problem to solve in the entire paper. A big part of the technical meat was devoted to solving that very problem. And I wanted at least to convey to the audience that there was something going on here. But I knew that by the time I had presented the rest of the material, and I got to this slide, I would have very little time remaining. Seconds. Less time than I've spent right now explaining the problem to you. So I showed the slide. I did this part and talked over it. And then I said, this looks easy. It's not. Read the paper. Of course, that phrase wasn't one that I hit on the spot. It was in my notes. And I found out afterwards that it had been quite memorable because people came up to me saying, this looks easy, it's not. I'm going to put that in my talks. So that kind of thing is worth thinking about. If you're giving a talk in English and it's not your native language, then you might want to plan a few more phrases in detail. I plan in more detail when I'm going to speak in Swedish, which I do from time to time. So there we are. That's about all I have time for. So I said, if there's one thing that people should remember from your talk, you should know what it is, and you make sure they remember it. I'm sorry. I have 3 things you should remember from this talk. Number 1, be concrete and use examples. Number 2, don't put too much on your slides. And number 3, make sure you put on a good show. Do those 3 things, and I will look forward to listening to your talks in future. Thank you. That's true, and you may very well feel, this is science. Yes. I don't need to put on a show. Yes. But actually, I think my experience suggests that you do have to. That people will listen more, and they'll take away your ideas much better if you do put on a bit of a show. I should say, also, you might be afraid of going over the top and giving a talk that is more substance than science. Maybe I've seen that happen once or twice in my entire career. But it's very unlikely. Why? Because we're nerds. We love the technology. Nothing will stop us talking about it. So adding a bit of a show to that really does lift a talk. So I recommend it. I bet you at the end of this week, the talks you remember best will be the ones where speakers did that.
Okay, there was another question. Yes.
How do you prepare for a talk, especially when you hold it the first time? Maybe at the beginning of the talk, like how you experience, maybe you don't do preparation, but...
Yes, so I build it according to the principles that I've talked about. So examples first. I watch videos by people like Simon Peyton-Jones on giving a great talk. But then as I prepare the talk, I give the talk to myself again and again and again. And nothing beats practice. As you practice, you realize every time, you realize there are things you would like to change. You think of better ways of saying what it is you want to say. What's very important is to time yourself. I time each section of the talk, so I know precisely how long each part will take. And that's the basis that I use later on to decide which parts I'm going to skip if time runs short. But practicing it again and again, including just before you give it, I think that's the most important advice that I can give there.
Not just to yourself, right?
What?
Not just to yourself, also.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, it's good to practice giving a talk to other people as well, and then their feedback can be very helpful. So at Chalmers, when our students are going to give a talk, of course they give a talk to the research group, and then we give feedback on things like that font is far too small, or you could present the material this way instead. But when I personally do it, then I'm often not in sufficiently good time to practice giving the talk for other people, and I end up giving it for myself. And you can do that any number of times, and every time you do it will improve the final result. It's also very good for dealing with nerves, because if you've practiced the talk enough times, it doesn't matter how nervous you are, it's still going to come out.
So if you specify your script for your talk in terms of just bullet points, how do you avoid sort of rambling? Because when I find that I don't have a sort of predefined script, I end up rambling between the points, and it ends up taking longer.
Well, maybe you should put the bullet points in a little bit more detail then. But did I ramble today?
No.
I hope not.
It wasn't. But I was just wondering how have you noticed that, or?
No, but I think you are probably not planning in sufficient detail.
Right.
So a little bit more detail, perhaps a slightly longer script. And practice. Practice will mean that if you ramble as you're practicing, you'll discover that, and you will think about how to avoid it when the time comes.
Thank you so much. Oh, okay. One quick.
So in your presentation, you mentioned one thing. You said that you can have 100 different ideas, but be concrete and focus on that one idea. But then you were switching between these two terms. One is you're presenting your paper, and the other is you're presenting your work. So in general, these are they can be two different things, right? Because your work can comprise of several different things, and your paper is probably just one idea that you're working towards. So I had a little confusion there. So if you're trying to present the general overview of our work, how can we just present this one idea and then say that you can look at the other points? Where are they going to look at?
Well, don't present a general overview of your work in a conference talk. Because you need far more time than is available to do that.
I attended a couple of talks yesterday that was sort of presenting some new areas that people are trying to pursue. And they had like 30 to 45 minutes of slides.
Okay. That's a different kind of talk, I think, if you're trying to give an introduction to an area or a tutorial for people. And you have to prepare that in a different sort of way. If you're giving a tutorial on a subject, you should have a very clearly defined subject that you're giving a tutorial on. Then you should have picked out maybe 5 or 6 ideas within that subject that you want to cover in your talk. That's very different from giving a talk about a paper in which there should be one theme in the paper. There should be the key idea or the key ideas. And those are the ones that you really want to get over. The technical details, the 5 interested people will read the paper later.